See any checks on your power on the world stage? Is there anything that could stop you if you wanted to?
Yeah, there's one thing: my own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop,
Not
and
international
that's
law?
very good. I don't need international law. I'm not looking to hurt people.
January 3rd, 2026. Delta Force operators storm Caracas at 2 a.m. 5 hours later, Nicolas Maduro is in a DEA detention center in Brooklyn. The operation itself isn't the story. What Trump said afterward is, I don't need international law. My own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop me. When pressed if his administration needs to abide by international law, I do. But it depends what your definition of international law is. That's not just Trump being Trump. That's the sound of the entire post-1945 global order cracking. Here's what people miss. International law didn't survive because countries obeyed it. It survived because they pretended to. Russia didn't say it broke the law in Ukraine. The United States didn't admit it broke the law in Iraq. Israel doesn't say it's breaking the law in Gaza. China doesn't say it's violating the law in the South China Sea. They all claimed legality. They all told a story. The U.S. went to the UN with Colin Powell's anthrax vial and talked about weapons of mass destruction. Everyone knew it was nonsense, but they still played the game. Article 51, humanitarian intervention, legal memos, white papers. The details mattered less than the performance because the pretending was the system, and Trump just stopped pretending. When you had to justify violations, it created friction. Legal teams had to write memos. Bill Barr's 1989 opinion justifying the Panama invasion got dusted off, but at least someone had to write it, vet it, make it sound plausible. Diplomatic effort was required. You had to bring allies along. The UK and France had to vote at the Security Council. Coalition building meant compromise. Rhetorical constraints limited how far you could go. If you justified Iraq with WMD threat, you couldn't also claim you were there for the oil. The justification boxed you in. International institutions got to weigh in. The UN held meetings. The ICC opened investigations. These didn't stop anything, but they created accountability moments. That friction slowed escalation. It forced second thoughts. It created political costs. Trump eliminated the friction. The Venezuela operation wasn't improvised. The CIA tracked Maduro for months using a source close to him. Delta Force built a mock-up of his safe house in Florida and rehearsed. Trinidad and Tobago quietly gave the U.S. access to its airports. By late November 2025, the U.S. had assembled the largest military presence in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The operation began at 2 a.m. on January 3, 2026. Maduro was captured by 5:21 a.m. at Fuerte Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex. At least 23 Venezuelan security officers died. So did 32 Cuban intelligence personnel. Havana had people on the ground. At his Mar-a-Lago press conference, Trump didn't hide the ball. He said the U.S. would run Venezuela indefinitely. He cited Venezuela's 1976 nationalization of oil as theft from American companies. He said seized oil could go to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve or be sold for reimbursement. Stephen Miller, Trump's deputy chief of staff, put it plainly. We live in a world that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world that have existed since the beginning of time. Trump's November 2025 national security strategy introduced what he calls the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, a formal assertion of U.S. sphere of influence over the Western Hemisphere. At his January 3rd press conference, Trump made it explicit. U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. He's already threatened Colombia and Cuba. He's demanded Greenland from Denmark and the Panama Canal back from Panama. Here's the tell. Look at who didn't condemn it strongly. Europe issued milquetoast statements. The UK representative at the UN Security Council emergency meeting spoke for 5 minutes without mentioning the US by name. Spain called for de-escalation. Denmark was closely monitoring. The global south sees this clearly. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Uruguay, South Africa, Indonesia, Bangladesh. 125 countries supported Venezuela at the Security Council. Not because they love Maduro, because they recognize what's happening. The world is being carved into spheres of influence. The U.S. gets the Western Hemisphere. Russia gets Eastern Europe. China gets Asia. Everyone else is on their own. Former Italian PM Giuseppe Conte got it. If rules only apply to enemies and not to friends, no one can feel safe anymore. Russia condemned the operation. So did China. But notice what they didn't do. Russia didn't deploy forces. China didn't send naval assets. Both issued statements and moved on. Why? Because they're reading the map. If the US can claim the Western Hemisphere as its exclusive domain, that's precedent for Russia to claim Eastern Europe and China to claim the Indo-Pacific. Trump's national security strategy explicitly talks about spheres of influence. Marco Rubio said it plainly. This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be a base of operation for adversaries. Substitute Eurasia for Western Hemisphere and Russia for United States. That's Putin's entire Ukraine justification. The three nuclear superpowers are forming an implicit compact. We each get our backyard. International law doesn't constrain us, and everyone else has to accept it. Taiwan fears China will copy the operation. They're missing the forest for the trees. The real victims are the 150-plus countries who aren't in anyone's sphere of influence, the ones who relied on the performance of legality to have any standing at all, the ones who thought international law meant something beyond what the powerful decide. Colombia just watched the U.S. bomb its neighbor and kidnap a head of state. What happens when Bogota irritates Washington, Ecuador, Peru? None of them can resist U.S. military action if it comes. The global South now understands. The rules-based order didn't die. It was revealed to never have existed. What existed was a system where great powers pretended to follow rules when violating them. Now they don't even pretend. With President Trump, the U.S. are abandoning the rules-based order that has shaped us since 1945. The coup in Venezuela marks a return to the old U.S. doctrine from before 1940, a mindset of thinking in terms of spheres of influence, where the law of force rules, not international law. Before 1940, before the UN, before the entire architecture of multilateral order, we're not heading back to the Cold War. We're heading back to 1880s-style great power competition. Spheres of influence, gunboat diplomacy, might makes right. If international law is dead, what constrains escalation? The justification game created breaks. You couldn't invade for oil and claim humanitarian intervention. Pick one story. You had to maintain plausible deniability. You had to keep allies on board. You had to at least pretend tomorrow's precedent might constrain you. Trump eliminated those breaks. What happens when China takes Taiwan and says spheres of influence? When Russia pushes into Moldova and says regional security? When the US invades Cuba or takes Greenland? The answer used to be international condemnation, sanctions, institutional pressure. None of that requires the aggressor to care. And they've just learned they don't have to. We're not watching the collapse of international law. We're watching the end of the shared pretense that had ever constrained great powers. That pretense was the order. What comes next is raw power politics with 21st century weapons and 19th century rules. And everyone outside the three spheres, they're about to learn what it meant to be a small country in 1914.